Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have really detailed conservation plans for every species of fish, wildlife, and plant in Vermont. So we have to prioritize certain species. And black bears are one of those species that we do prioritize. And so we know in order to have a healthy bear population, our bears need access to different types of wetland habitats to find the foods that they need. They need access to different young forest habitats to find the foods they need. They also need access to mature forests to find the foods they need. And because these habitat types aren't necessarily right next to each other, they also need a connected landscape so that they can safely move around to find these different habitats. And so if we have a healthy bear population, it means we're doing a good job providing all these different types of habitats and a connected landscape in Vermont. And that means we're also providing those habitats for all the other species that rely on them. And so we're effectively treating black bears as what we call an umbrella species. So by having a detailed conservation plan for black bears, it means we're also helping a lot of other species and habitats in the state. So our bear program is kind of a four-pronged approach. We are responsible for overseeing the state's bear hunting season. And so we work with bear hunters to collect important biological data from every bear that's harvested. And it's actually this information that allows us to estimate how many bears we have in Vermont. And it's not a perfect census, so it's not an exact number, but it gives us a ballpark understanding of how many bears there are in the state. And probably more importantly, it allows us to track changes in our population over time. So it allows us to see, is our bear population growing, decreasing, or stable? We also put a lot of effort into habitat conservation for bears. So the state actively works to conserve land in Vermont. We're involved in the management of state-owned land for wildlife habitat. We also, through the regulatory review process in Act 250, we have biologists that review development projects for potential impacts to bears and try to work with developers to minimize those impacts. And then, of course, we also provide advice and technical assistance to private landowners who are working on wildlife habitat management projects. We occasionally engage in research. Traditionally, our research has been focused on understanding how big development projects impact bear habitat use. And then finally, an ever-growing part of what we do is working with the public to try to resolve conflicts between people and bears, and then trying to prevent future conflicts. But really, for these efforts to be successful, we can't do it alone. We need all Vermonters to take an active role in helping to make Vermont a good place for bears to live. So again, that's kind of the goal of the presentation tonight. I want to give all of you some information and tools that you can use to take a more active role in our bear conservation program. And so I see that as a three-step process. The first step is just to learn about bears, to better understand their behaviors, their needs, and then think about what you can do to help manage Vermont's lands for bears, and then what you can do to help keep bears wild. So we'll start by talking a little bit about some basic bear facts. Black bears are a relatively long-lived species. They've been documented living well into their 30s. They're also a relatively intelligent species. So they have shown to be good problem solvers. They've also been shown to have good memories, and they seem to learn from their life experiences. Their sense of smell is their best sense. And so that's really the best sense that they have for interpreting the world around them. But of course, they also have decent eyesight and hearing as well. And they're an opportunistic omnivore. And so this means that they have a very diverse diet, and they're very flexible in their diet. So they're always willing to find new and better foods. So in Vermont, The majority of a bear's diet actually comes from plants. They do eat vegetation, so grasses and leaves and things like that. But really the bulk of their diet comes from the fruits produced by plants. So nuts and berries. They do eat a lot of insects, and they will opportunistically eat meat. And typically in Vermont, most of their meat is probably coming from newborn deer fawns and moose calves, but really only newborns when they're most vulnerable. They will also eat bird eggs, nestling birds, and they will scavenge on carcasses if they find them. But something to keep in mind with all these foods is that they're not available all of the time, and they're not available everywhere. So if you really want to start thinking about how bears are using our landscape, I think it's really helpful to first think about what season is it, which of these foods are available, and where can you find these foods? So if we start with the spring, the food that's most readily available for bears is vegetation. This is when our plants are actively putting on new growth, and that new growth is the most digestible part of a plant from a bear's perspective. So they're wandering through the forest, eating, baby leaves as they're developing, but places that they're really seeking out are openings where there's lots of grasses and sedge growing. So places like big open wetlands like beaver meadows. They also like fields, log landings, skidder roads, ski slopes, and sometimes even our back lawn. And then as we transition into summer, the plants are shifting their energy from growing more vegetation into growing their seeds. And so bears are really looking for plants that are putting their seeds into fruits, specifically berries at this time of the year, or what we call soft mast. So things like cherries, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, and then later in the summer, apples. And so most of the plants that produce these fruits that bears want, they need a lot of sunlight. And so they're going to grow in areas that don't have a lot of canopy cover, and in areas that we call young forests. So areas that don't have a lot of mature trees. So old abandoned apple orchards are a good place. Power lines are also typically a good place to find bears in the summer. Again, various types of shrubby wetlands are also a good place. And then relatively recent, like patch cuts, are another good place to find bears in the summer. And then as we transition into fall, that's when our nuts, or what we call hard mast, become available. And here in Vermont, the two most common nuts that are available for bears are beech nuts and acorns. They will also feed on hickory nuts, but really acorns and beech nuts are the two that they seek out the most. And research has shown that where bears have access to both beech nuts and acorns, the average bear will choose to feed on beech nuts instead. And that's just because despite how small beech nuts are, they're actually a more calorically dense nut than an acorn. And if you did your own taste test, you'd see that they actually taste a lot better than acorns as well, especially our red oak acorns. So bears are typically trying in the fall to find beech nuts to eat. One challenge for them, though, is that beech trees typically only produce big nut crops every other year. So in those good beech nut years, we'll see bears going into beech stands to forage. And in poor beech nut years, they'll go into the oak forest to look for nuts. And I put these pictures here to kind of give you visual cues to look for. If you're walking through a beech stand and you see all scarred claw marks on the trunk of the beech tree, that's a good indication that bears are seeking out that tree to feed from. Or if you look up in the canopy and you see clumps of broken branches, that's another good indication that bears like to feed in that beech stand. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple examples of how bears will move across the landscape to seek out beech nuts and acorns in the fall. So this slide is showing a map from a bear that we've had wearing a GPS satellite collar down in southern Vermont. So for those of you who are familiar with this area, this big body of water here is Harriman Reservoir. And then you can see the towns of Whitingham and Reedsboro here. The yellow circles represent the GPS locations of this bear. She was a 3-year-old female at this time. This blue line here kind of represents what we considered her core home range. And then up here, you can see these black polygons are concentrations of beech, mature beech trees. And so in the fall of 2015, there was a really good beech nut crop. And this bear traveled about 5 miles outside of her core home range to seek out these concentrations of beech trees. She spent about 2 months foraging on beech nuts in those stands before then returning back to her home range to den for the winter. And now, like I said, beech trees tend to only produce a big nut crop every other year. So if we look at her movements from the previous year in 2014, there was a really poor beech nut crop. So now here's that core home range again, now shifted to the top of our screen. This yellow line represents actually the Vermont-Massachusetts state line. And so in the fall, beech nuts weren't available, but that fall acorns were very plentiful. So she traveled around 9 miles south of her core home range into Massachusetts, where there's a lot more oak in the forest compared to her home range. And she foraged on acorns for about a month and a half before then again returning back to her core home range to den for the winter. And I'm going to show one more example, a more extreme example of how these animals will move to find good fall food. So this is a different adult female that we had collared. So again, you can see Harriman Reservoir here. This female bear's core home range is just a little bit farther west from that last bear. In the fall of 2018, again, it was a really poor beech nut year. And she has no oak trees in her home range, just trees in terms of fall foods. So she, just like that last female, started to move south into Massachusetts where oaks are more plentiful. But unfortunately in 2018, northwestern Massachusetts, their oak trees didn't produce much for acorns. So she kept on moving south all the way to southwestern Massachusetts, where she finally found oak stands that were producing a lot of acorns. And so she spent about a month down in southwestern Massachusetts before in late October, she started making her way north again, back into her core home range. And the cool thing about this movement is that she did this with 2 cubs. And so round trip, as the crow flies, it was around 65 miles that she traveled to find good food. And so a big reason why they're willing to make these huge movements to find plentiful foods in the fall is because they know scarcity is coming. Once winter sets in, all those foods that they rely on become unavailable. And so a bear's strategy is to put on as much fat as it can in the fall so that it can then curl up in a den all winter and live off of that stored fat. And there's a lot of debate about if bears are true hibernators or not, but they do go into a very reduced physiological state that allows them to conserve the energy and the fat and food they've put on during the fall. And they're able to survive without eating for months on end. And so the primary thing that is driving most bears into a winter den is the lack of food. And so in Vermont, our denning period typically starts in November or December and lasts until April. But there's a lot of variability that goes along with that. You know, if we have a really good beech nut crop and we don't get any snow cover until the end of December, you may have a good number of bears, especially male bears, who are going to stay out and keep eating until that snow comes and covers up those beech nuts. Bears will select all sorts of different den types for the winter. They typically pick a different den every year. But what we've seen is that they always will choose a spot within their core home range to den. So even if they leave their home range to find food, they always come back to den. Common types of dens that we've seen are cavities under the root systems of trees. We've seen them go into the actual cavities of trees before, which is what you can kind of see in this middle picture. That was an adult sow and her yearling that were denned inside that cavity. They like to go into the holes and cavities under rocks and boulders, which is what you're kind of seeing here. One of my coworkers who's around 6'3", crawling in to reach a bear. They also really like just down logs and blown over trees too, which is what these two bears down here were using. Some dens are really great. They're like fortresses, and they keep the bear very dry and out of the elements all winter. Other dens, like the one in this bottom corner, it might be hard for you to see, but that's actually the bear right there. He's getting snowed on top of. So some dens are kind of crappy, really, if you think about it. We're always surprised when we find things like that. But they do the trick. They help them get through the winter. And so here's an example of a collared female bear using a giant cavity yellow birch tree as a den site. And I'll start that video over again so you can watch it again. And this is kind of a cool den site because you can see there's all sorts of holes going into this tree. But she was using a hole that was way, way up high on the tree to get in there. You'll also see from the video that this was taken on April 14th. So she was still denning at that point. And a big reason why she was still in the den at that point was because she had little cubs and they weren't quite big enough yet to leave the den. And so she was forced to kind of come out, and we'd see from this videos that she'd come out, she'd eat some snow most days, and then just go back in to take care of the cubs till they were strong enough to start traveling with her. And then here's another bear using a cavity inside a tree. This is a 3-year-old male bear. And sometimes they're kind of like mice. As long as they can get their head in, they can get the rest of their body in. This is a really small entrance. The other thing that's interesting about this video is that, again, they kind of cycle through these reduced physiological states when they're denning. So sometimes you might walk up to a bear den and it is completely out of it. They're not aware you're there. But other times when we go up to these dens and we look in, the bear is wide awake and looking back at us. So again, like I said, they're kind of cycling throughout the winter in different physiological states. And then this is an example of another adult male bear using a rock cavity for his den. And in the picture, you can see my coworker and I, we're kind of at the entrance of the den when we were trying to change his collar. And then this video was taken a couple days after we left. And he's coming out and kind of sniffing everywhere we had been and just kind of checking out what we had been doing while we were there. But even after coming out and moving around like this, he went back into that den for a couple more weeks. All right, and to kind of tie all this together, I just want to give you kind of the day in the life of a bear over a 2-year period from the perspective of a female bear. So this female bear will enter her den, let's say in early November. In January, she'll give birth to a litter of cubs. typically 1 to 3 cubs. And then usually by like mid-April, those cubs are big enough and strong enough that the whole family will leave the den together and start traveling around her home range. And through this process, she's showing them what is food and where to find food. By fall, they enter this altered physiological state that we call hyperphagia, which basically just means they become eating machines. And that's when they become super focused on putting on all that weight. And then in November, the whole family will crawl into a den together for the winter. Then in year 2, they will leave the den again as a family together and spend the spring foraging and looking for food again as a family unit. And then typically somewhere, usually in early June, the family will start breaking up. And those cubs, we call them yearlings at that point because they're a little over a year old. They will start traveling away from their mother, looking to set up their own home range. Her daughters will typically find a home range nearby, sometimes even overlapping with her, but her sons will travel long, long distances away. And for young male bears, that dispersal process can take anywhere from 1 to 2 years before they really set up shop somewhere. And that dispersal process is usually timed with the bear breeding season. So she's typically coming into estrus at some point in June, meaning she's receptive to breeding from a male. She will often breed with more than one male. So she may spend a few days traveling with one male, sometimes even over a week. But she'll, again, breed usually with at least a couple of the dominant males in her area. So that's kind of a cool thing about bears is that litters of cubs can actually have mixed paternity, so different fathers. Another really cool thing about bears is that even though she's breeding in June, the sperm is fertilizing the egg, but it's not implanting in the uterus then. So it goes into this state of suspension. And so you see on this timeline, it doesn't actually start developing into fetuses until November. So that's really when she becomes pregnant. And so then after she's done breeding, she gets some time to herself for the rest of the summer and fall to forage on her own. And then again in November, she'll enter a den and start the whole process over again. So with all of that information, I thought it'd be kind of helpful to just put together a little checklist of if you are a woodlot owner or you are a manager of forest, what are some things you can think about if you want to make management decisions that might benefit bears? So a big one is trying to promote mast producing tree species. So again, things like beech and oak, but other important species are black cherry, hickory, serviceberry. Think about how you can promote mast producing shrub species. So things like blackberry, raspberries, blueberries, cherries. Again, these are species that usually need a lot of sunlight, so they need a more open canopy. Winterberry is something that would more commonly be found around wetlands. So trying to maintain good wetland habitats if those are part of your forest. Beaked hazelnut is another shrub species that bears really like. Promote down logs. These could be used as denning structures, or again, they're a good source for insects. Promoting large cavity trees and snags, again, as potential denning structures, but also as sources of insects. And then of course, we always recommend just thinking about habitat diversity and thinking about the diversity on the property that you're managing or the property that you own, and even thinking about that diversity in a larger kind of more landscape context. So what are the neighbors doing on their properties as well? All right, so now we're gonna shift gears and kind of briefly talk about conflicts between people and bears. In an ideal world, our bears would just stay out in the woods eating nuts and berries all year. But but that's not the reality we live in. So we also need to think about what's going on in our backyards. And so why do bears come into our backyards? Well, they're looking for food. And there's a lot of reasons that may drive a bear into our backyard. But the most common is a lack of natural foods. So, I use the example of beech nuts. Beech trees don't tend to produce nuts every year. So there are some years when those nuts and other nuts are just hard to find for bears. There's other years where we may have a drought, we may have a late frost, various things like that that can just make those berries and nuts and even things like grasses and leaves less productive. Like I said earlier, bears are opportunistic omnivores, so they have a natural curiosity to discover new foods. And some bears are more curious and more bold than others. And then the thing that we like to avoid is habituation, or what we call food conditioning. And this is when a bear has had enough encounters with people's backyards where they've easily and safely been able to find food over and over again, that instead of just coming to your backyard in times of scarcity, they start looking at backyards as a reliable, constant source of food. And so the main types of human foods that will bring bears into our yards are birdseed, garbage, chickens, beehives, pet food, and then agricultural corn is another big one. So let's talk about bird feeders real quick. We look at bird feeders as the gateway drug. And a big reason is because if you think about what you're putting in your bird feeder, it's seeds produced by plants. It's very similar to the natural foods that they're already looking for in the forest. Only instead of having to forage around under the leaf litter, here is all the calories they could want in an easy, convenient tube. So it's not a big stretch for them to start looking for bird seed as a food source. And I put on this slide, it's teaching bad habits, because again, remember, we talked about the life of a female bear. A big part of what she's doing is trying to put on enough weight so that she can keep her cubs alive, but she's also teaching them what is food and where is food. And again, these are relatively long-lived animals with good memories. So this female bear may be around for 10, 20, 30 years, and her cubs may also be around for 10, 20, 30 years. And so this could just kind of snowball into a persistent problem. And it honestly teaches us bad habits too, because it's really enticing to get to see these beautiful animals up close from the comfort of your picture window. But it can have really bad consequences. And I'll have people say to me like, okay, I understand, I shouldn't put a bird feeder out, but it's okay, I've made my bird feeder bear proof. And I always like to show these slides and remind you that bears are very good problem solvers, and they're very persistent when it comes to high quality foods. And even if you are able to make your bird feeder bear proof, remember what's really bringing them in initially is the smell of the bird seed. So if you've successfully outsmarted the bear, it still can smell those bird seed. And once it gets into your backyard and realizes it can't get the bird feeder, it might start looking for other things that you have in your backyard. Or what does your neighbor have in their backyard? Is there garbage? Is there compost? So again, the best option is to just not put out a bird feeder when bears are out. And our general rule of thumb is April 1st to December 1st. But keep in mind what I said earlier about what drives bears into their den is a lack of natural food. So if we have a really big acorn crop or beech nut crop and a late snow, you may want to wait until the second half of December before you put out your bird feeders. And the other thing I'll say about bird feeders is I'll also get people telling me that they take their bird feeder in at night. Just notice that all those pictures I just showed you were taken during the day. Bears are not necessarily nocturnal. They can be active at all times. So really the best rule of thumb is just don't put your bird feeder out in the spring, summer, and fall. Right. Garbage is a little trickier. Bird feeding is a choice that we can make. Generating garbage, unfortunately, is something that we all do. And again, we're opportunistic omnivores. Bears are opportunistic omnivores. So we have a lot of overlap in our diets. Only bears are way less picky than we are. So the key to keeping a bear out of your garbage is proper storage and controlling the odors. Store your garbage in some sort of secure structure. So a basement, a garage, a shed. If you don't have any secure structure where you can store your garbage, you really should invest in a bear-proof or bear-resistant garbage container. So there are manufactured bear-proof garbage cans. They are more expensive. They can be harder to find. So there's lots of advice online and on our website on how you can actually build your own bear-proof garbage can. And the key things to look for is you want a metal or very thick plastic can, and you're going to have to add like some latches or some sort of screw top to keep the bears out. And then controlling the odors, frequent trips to your transfer station. If you have any really smelly food scraps and you know it's going to be a while before you can get to your dump, you can consider freezing them. And you can also consider using things like ammonia or mothballs near your garbage can or around the door or windows of the structure where you're storing your garbage to help minimize those enticing odors. Compost isn't something we used to have to talk about much, but it is becoming a bigger issue. And it's really the same as our garbage. You need to think about controlling the odor and secure storage. So we really recommend that you invest in some sort of tumbler instead of just doing an open pit compost. And then really pay attention to the compost recipe. It should be 3 parts brown materials to 1 part kitchen scraps or green materials. So make sure you're really putting in a lot of those brown materials like leaves, sawdust, wood chips, hay, paper, things like that that will help keep the odors down. And they'll help the composting process happen faster too. And then don't put meat or dairy in your compost. For folks who have backyard chickens or beehives, electric fencing is really your best option. More and more people are getting interested in raising chickens, and thinking about purchasing an electric fence and learning how to use it properly really needs to be part of owning chickens. Because again, there's just too much about chickens that bears like. They like the feed, they like the eggs, and they like the chickens themselves. And the same goes for raising bees as well. Both of these too closely mimic a lot of their natural foods. And the reason this is all important is because allowing bears to forage in our backyards can lead to property damage. So it can be expensive, it can be frustrating for us to deal with. It can, in some cases, create a threat to human safety, but more often it creates a threat to the safety and well-being of our bears. Every year, bears are killed in Vermont over conflict situations. But something I think a lot of people also don't think about is bears that are foraging in backyards are more likely to spend time crossing roads, making them more vulnerable to being hit and killed by vehicles. I think another thing we hear from some folks is like, well, I don't mind if I lose a few chickens to a bear. And that's fine from your perspective, but your neighbor or another member of your community who might live 5 or 10 miles away may not feel the same way. And that bear is traveling. And so if they're getting chickens in your backyard, they're probably looking for chickens in someone else's backyard. And then occasionally we will have bears that become so food conditioned and so bold around people that they start trying to break into people's houses. And those are situations that become very unsafe for people, and those bears have to be destroyed, unfortunately. So to avoid all of that, again, there's just some basic steps to think about. Only feed birds during the winter months. I know getting to watch birds is a really fun, wonderful way to interact with wildlife. So if you do feed birds during the summer and want to kind of cut the habit, I recommend you check out Audubon's Native Plants for Birds. This is a really good resource to give you ideas for types of flowers and shrubs that you can plant in your backyard that will still attract and feed birds. Do your part or the best you can to keep your garbage secure. So again, store it in some sort of bear-proof container or building. Control the odors. Go to your dump as often as you can during the summer and spring especially. Use electric fences if you have things like chickens or bees. If you have fruit trees or bushes, harvest your ripe fruit promptly. Keep your grill clean, so make sure you're cleaning it immediately after every use. And then don't feed your pets outside. And I'll just say there's a ton more information on our website. So if you go to vtfishandwildlife.com, if you go to the Learn More section, we have all sorts of information about living with wildlife, including living with bears, information about how to compost in bear country, how to retrofit your trash can to keep bears out. But I think of interest is also that we have a link where you can report a bear incident. So if you're having an issue with a bear, this is a good place where you can submit a report to us. And if you want, you can put on there that you'd like someone from Fish and Wildlife to contact you back to give you more advice. Or you don't even have to do that. You can just submit the report just so we know what's going on. It's a helpful way for us to know what types of problems people are having and where in the state we're seeing a lot of problems. And then if you go to our website, to our lands and habitat section, we have lots of good resources for landowners who want to manage their land, whether it's their woodlot or their backyard for wildlife. So again, I'll just say kind of in closing, think about what you can do to be a good neighbor for our black bears and for each other by helping to keep Vermont's bears wild. And I'll also make just a quick plug. A lot of our funding comes from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and federal taxes on hunting and fishing gear. But we do have other opportunities for people to make contributions to the habitat work that we do through our Vermont Habitat Stamp, and to make donations for our Non-Game Wildlife Fund, which generates a lot of the resources that we have for the conservation and management of our rare, threatened, and endangered species. And with that, I will end the slideshow and take questions. Oops. All right. Oh, you're on mute still, Kathy.
I am on mute. Oh my God, that is the new saying. Thank you so much. That was excellent. I learned so much. I have a million questions myself, but I'm going to go through the chat box first and see what we have here.
Sure.
So, oh yes, here's my friend Jock. He wanted to know about that Japanese knotwood in the background. The knotwood in the background of your early photo.
Yes, I think that picture was actually one I borrowed from New Hampshire. So I don't even know whose property it is, but those bears were feeding on the grass in the yard, not the knotweed, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's what we'd like them to get rid of.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can put this in a better way on my screen and make it easier to read. Okay. How old do beech trees have to be to produce nuts?
Oh, that's a great question that I honestly don't know off the top of my head. 'Cause so much can go into that, but typically if you're at, if your property is not at like a really high elevation, I would say if you're seeing a diameter, I've seen bears climb trees with diameters in like maybe the 6-inch range, or diameter at breast height, DBH. You may hear your forester use that term. But I'm not sure how old that tree is. I'm thinking more picturing size. But the bigger, the better, typically. The other thing to look at is the crown of your beech trees. So again, once they start getting to be around 6 inches and bigger in terms of the diameter near the base, looking up and looking at how robust and full that crown looks is a good indication. Something I didn't get into is, of course, beech bark disease, which most of our beech trees have exposure to at this point. Or they all have exposure to, but some are more resistant or tolerant of the disease than others. So if you see a lot of poxing and just really, really rough, messy looking beech trunks, your trees are probably sick with beech bark disease. But one thing we have found is that doesn't necessarily stop them from making beech nuts. So we've seen bears, for example, those slides I showed of those bears traveling up to those big concentrations of beech stands in the study that we're doing. Most of the trees in those stands are very heavily diseased. They look very sickly, but they're still producing a lot of nuts, and they're still drawing in bears throughout the region. So
thank you. That was actually a question I wrote down because I have a lot of beech and a lot of oak, but the beech all has beech bark disease, basically. And I wondered what impact that had on the nuts or, the food source.
yeah, they are still producing a food source for bears and other wildlife species as well, despite disease.
Yeah. So the next question, will open compost piles draw bears?
They can. It used to be before everyone in Vermont was composting. We told folks it wasn't a major attraction. But like I said, bears learn. And so they're starting to learn to kind of key into those compost piles. But if you're doing a really good job sticking with that brown material to green material ratio of 3 to 1, and you're turning it frequently, and you've really got a good composting process going on, it really should help minimize the chance that it's going to attract a bear. But you want to make sure you're controlling those other attractants too. So if you have a bird feeder out or your garbage is just kept outside, there's more chance that a bear is going to find your compost too.
Yeah, sorry, I should mention who's asking the questions. I'll try to do that. So from Susan, very happy that you are working on educating the public about what we can all do to make the environment safe for bears and to discourage habituation to human sources of food. I hope that Vermont Fish and Wildlife, just lost my place here, sorry, conducts more of these educational sessions for communities to help protect the well-being of bears, as well as the safety of people and livestock. Yes, and thank you. Much appreciated for sure. From Chuck, when will Vermont ban harassing bears with dogs?
So that is something that's kind of been in the public debate recently. And honestly, there are pros and cons to it. From a conflict perspective, having trained people and trained hounds to chase bears out of communities and backyards is actually a technique a lot of states use to help kind of discourage bears from foraging within communities. That's one of the pros of it, but I know a lot of folks feel uncomfortable with the idea of using hounds. I will say from that research study that we have been working on since 2012 at this point, you know, we have actually worked with some houndsmen to help us capture bears for research purposes. So I have had firsthand experience seeing how those dogs work. And well-trained hounds, it's not, I think, the free-for-all that it sometimes is portrayed as. These dogs are pretty well behaved, they're very well trained, and their handlers do a pretty good job of keeping them under control and focused on the target at hand. And for the most part, the bears very quickly go up a tree, and, you know, outside of the hunting season, the handlers go grab the dogs, leave, and the bear comes down and then just goes back to doing what it was doing. But at this point, you know, we're kind of listening to public comments about it. And it's honestly, we could do a whole a whole presentation on bear hunting techniques. I feel like it's a big ball of wax that could take a lot of time to get into a lot of detail.
So Lisa is also saying this was very informative. I have 2 questions about bear hunting season. My understanding is that 20% of the bear population was taken last year. Can you explain why that was? And are there any plans to shorten the bear season this year?
So not for this year. Last year was a record high harvest. And partially that was because it was a poor natural food year. So we had a lot of bears coming out of those mature forests and out of the woods looking for more human-related foods at the early part of the season. And so specifically corn was a big draw. So in August and into September, when our bear season starts, September 1, we had a lot of bears in agricultural areas, and they were just more vulnerable to hunters. We also, because of COVID, had a lot more people looking for opportunities for outdoor recreation. So we had a lot more people participating in our bear hunting season. And so it was kind of just a perfect storm of natural conditions and a pandemic. And so really throughout the country, definitely throughout the Northeast, every state saw a much higher harvest than we normally do. Typically, in really good natural food years, we'll see a lower harvest, which again, you never can predict the cycles perfectly, but typically after we have a bad natural food year, we'll typically have a much stronger natural food year. So we're anticipating 2021 to be a much better natural food year. We're hoping that life will be going back to normal by the fall. So we may not have the same level of hunter participation. So we're not expecting this year to be a record harvest again. If it is, then obviously we're going to like reassess and look at the length of the season and and make some changes. But yeah, it's complicated. And like I said, that's kind of like those bear population estimates that we generate. It's you know, there's no perfect way to count every bear that we have in our woods. And so we actually haven't even, because of the pandemic and everyone being remote and things like that, and a backlog for some of the data that we need some of it analyzed from a lab out in Montana. And so we're still waiting to get back some of that data for us to do our population estimates. So we haven't even done last year's estimate yet, but we should have that done, I think, later this spring.
Thank you. From Gregory, how many bear per square mile in Vermont?
Oh, That is a hard question to answer. We know our estimate of bears across the entire state is somewhere between 3,500 and 5,500. That's kind of our target goal. And again, it fluctuates every year when we do that estimate, it fluctuates, usually somewhere within that range. But at this point, we aren't doing a regional estimate. We're just doing statewide estimates. And we're kind of exploring ways that we can get some more data so that we can better do regional estimates. We probably would never be able to perfectly say how many bears there are per, 5 square miles or per square mile. Because Vermont does have some diversity between the mountains and the valleys, Champlain Valley, the Connecticut River Valley. Habitat is just different in those places. And so you're going to have different densities of bears in those areas. But in general, the Champlain Valley, we don't have a lot of bears. The mountains used to be kind of our most productive part of the state for bears, but there's some indications that maybe, some of the other valleys like the Connecticut River Valley are becoming more productive because there's more of a diversity between oak and beech nuts, not just beech nuts like what we see in the mountains. So I know that's not the answer to your question, but kind of explaining why we don't have that perfect answer.
So from Paul, is it possible to create a den that a bear may use?
Yeah, creating like big brush piles. So that's something that bears will definitely use for dens. But I would say if you're managing your woodlot, hoping to get a bear to use it to den on, you don't need to like go way out of your way. If you, like I said, maintaining big, mature trees, cavity trees, snags, down logs. If you do have a tree, like an area where a bunch of trees blow over, consider leaving some of those blown down trees. If you are doing a harvest, leaving like a slash pile or brush pile. And yeah, a bear may use it, but there's no guarantee. There is a lot of options for them in our forests. And like I said, some bears will choose really unassuming dens, while others, they would seek out that brush pile that you might create for them. So it's hard to know.
So from Doug, he's asking about the density of bears, and I think you kind of answered that. So a follow-up on that, how large is the bear's home territory and how much do those territories overlap?
Great question. So again, the size of a bear's kind of core home range depends on how productive the habitat is. And I keep using this term core home range because like I showed with those female bears, during the spring and summer, they have a core area they spend their time. But in the fall, if there's not a lot of good food in that core home range, they may travel 5, 10, 20, 30 miles to a different area. But if you're thinking about just that core area, females bears home range might be 5 to 15 square miles. And the average male home range is probably going to be closer to 70 to 100 square miles. But bears will overlap their home ranges. They're not an exclusively territorial carnivore. They are in the carnivore order, but they're not like a coyote or a bobcat where they are actively trying to keep each other out of each other's home ranges. They'll have a lot of home range overlap. They do what we call resource sharing. So when food is really plentiful, you'll see a lot of bears feeding in the same area. Their strategy is more to just avoid each other. So they do a lot of scent marking so that they kind of know which other bears are around and when they're around and how to avoid each other. And they seem to have kind of like a social hierarchy going on where the big dominant males kind of get first pick of where they want to be and when they want to be there. And then mature females are kind of the next ones to get to pick when and where they want to be. And then your subadult bears are kind of the lower rung bears. So that's kind of how they're navigating with each other across the landscape.
So I have a question for you too. So seeing those dens in trees, I would never look at a tree like that and think that a bear was living in it. It just doesn't seem possible. What do you see? What are the signs that tell you there is a bear living there, short of seeing that bear?
Well, I mean, I have the advantage of the collar. So that's how I'm following them around. But I have learned over the years, there very often are visual markers to look for too. So like I just mentioned, bears like to do a lot of scent marking to communicate with each other. And so what we've found is near, like right next to a den, very often you'll see a tree where like the bark will look very disturbed. And sometimes you'll even see where like there's a big bite in the tree. And so the bear doing a lot of rubbing on that tree, biting that tree. The other thing you can look for is that they like to make like some bed material inside their den. So if very often if there's like a little softwood tree, like a hemlock or a spruce or a fir near their den, they'll actually break off a bunch of the branches and pull that into the den and lay it on the floor to lay on top of. They'll also very often scrape in a lot of leaves to do that as well. And then they'll even do that. Sometimes we'll see like hardwoods or things like hobble bush. They'll break those branches off and bring it in too. So it's a little bit subtle, but there are things to look for.
Okay, I will look at my snags a whole lot different now, for sure. So one more question here. It is 8:32. I don't want to keep you. I know you have a little one. Ken wants to know, am I a bad bear citizen if I put bird food down out in my woods, well away from any house, to make my woods more bear friendly?
Well, I would say it's a slippery slope. I would say you're better off to not do that. Only because there are a lot of natural foods out there for bears. It's not always pretty, you know, bears do have to suffer through some lean years. But I will say we do see in these really poor natural food years with some of these animals that we have collared and that we're studying, we will see their weights dip down to what seem scary low. And then the next year, they're right back up to a more like robust, healthy weight. So their bodies can tolerate really large swings in weight loss and weight gain. And I personally feel like it's just better to let them find food on their own, more natural food. And yeah, that's my recommendation. But again, if you're doing it in a way so that you're and really actually true, you know, technically it is illegal in Vermont to intentionally feed bears. So if you were going out and just sprinkling bird seed in your woods to intentionally feed a bear, and a neighbor, you know, if someone found that, a game warden or a neighbor, and reported it, you know, you would get a speaking to from a game warden about it too. So that's probably the other reason you shouldn't do it.
Thank you, Jackie. This has been excellent. I will have the recording available online and send out that link to everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here. Remind you, this was sponsored by Vermont Woodlands Association with partnership here from Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Please visit our website at vermontwoodlands.org. We'd love your support. The more members we have, the better off we are. Jackie, that was excellent. I so appreciate your time. I know you have family to tend to in the evening, and it was great of you to join us tonight.
Well, I'm happy to, and I'm glad everyone was able to join us and yeah, take some time to think about bears.
Yeah, thanks so much. Good night to all, folks. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Jackie, that was great. Oh, I can't hear you. What's going on?
I muted myself,
Oh, you
sorry.
muted yourself. Okay.
I was just gonna read through the comments real quick.
And okay, yeah, I can send you a transcript.
Oh, perfect.
I can send you the recording and that'll have the chat in there as well.
All right. Thanks so
Okay.
much, Kathleen.
Yes,
All right.
and you have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.